Okay, so the one thing we talked about last time was that there are few things that we can all agree on, some of the fundamentals. And one of those fundamentals was indeed that input is necessary, right? We saw that if you don't have any input in the target language, there couldn't be any output, right? So this is one thing that absolutely everybody 100% agrees with. And when sometimes I see even in social media, Twitter, things like, well, are you really sure? I think where that's coming from is because we're picturing slightly different definitions of output. And that's why I think webinars like tonight are so important. Absolutely. If there's no input, no output, if we're following the same definition of input and the same definition of output. Now, just because we're saying that input is necessary, and it is indeed necessary, and we all agree that it's necessary, that doesn't mean that output is unnecessary. That's the part where maybe not 100% agree with that. Dr. Krashen would be the first person that would disagree with that. But let's look at what other people say and why other people say that saying that input is necessary doesn't mean that output is unnecessary. Now, the one thing that we do see a lot in our materials and in our textbooks, especially, there's even been research on textbooks, Spanish textbooks, German textbooks, and all show the same pattern, that clearly there are a lot more output activities than input activities in textbooks. That doesn't mean that output is any more important than input. In fact, so they would tell you the opposite. Input is necessary. And so why is it that we keep favoring output in our classes, in our materials, in our assessments? I think there are many different reasons, and this is food for thought, because if you are teaching yourself favoring output too much, especially at the beginning, then it might be time to reconsider why that is happening. And I admit I'm one of those people that sometimes I do favor output in what I have the students do. And that's where I have to take a step back and think one more time, am I doing enough input before they get to the output? If you follow proficiency-based instruction and you follow ACTFL, you know this about the 3 modes of communication, the interpretive, presentational, interpersonal. 2 of those 3 modes, presentational and interpersonal, involve output. So even if you're like, well, no, but I'm communicative, I'm going to do the 3 modes and everything is graded the same, you inevitably end up favoring output in your grading, right? Because there is more output in those 3 modes. Only 1 mode really, the input one, would be interpretive. Another reason why I think we favor output is because whenever somebody thinks of communication, they think of expression. If anybody outside of a language classroom has told you, you need to communicate, what do they mean by you need to communicate? It means you need to express your needs, express your feelings, express yourself. So this association between communication and expression has led us to think also that communicative language teaching is about students talking. And when you think about it, interpretation of meaning is also communication, right? So understanding comprehension is definitely communication. So we need to break away from always associating communication with expression of meaning. I think inevitably output feels a lot more active. The students are doing something, whether it is sounds, whether it is symbols. The students are doing something. And unfortunately, input has this bad rap of being more passive. It doesn't have to be. And as we saw last time, there's many things that students can do with input that are actually very active. Even reading doesn't have to be a silent, individual, very passive activity, right? That there's a lot that they can do even while reading. The other thing that I think is almost inevitable is that, yes, output is going to be student-centered in the sense that the students are the ones creating meaning, whereas input tends to be teacher-centered. In our society, in our way of looking at education, student-centered always ends up being seen as good teaching, and teacher-centered not so much. The issue with that is that when we're saying that input is perhaps a little bit more teacher-centered because the teacher is the one, searching for the resources, giving the input, That is not a bad thing. In language teaching, that is not a bad thing. It can still be student-centered in the sense that you can still center the students in making it active. You can still center the students in their preferences and keeping in mind if something is relevant for them or not, letting them express opinions through input. So there's still a lot of input that can indeed be student-centered. So it doesn't have to be just lectures, but unfortunately, that's a little bit of the dichotomy that we ended up with. And then the other perhaps reason why we favor output in what we do in class is, well, output is more difficult. That is absolutely true. Comprehension always precedes production. So students always understand more than they can say. So then we fall into thinking that, well, see, they're good with input, they're good, they're understanding everything. Let's practice more output because that's where they're struggling. So we tend to think that they need more practice and therefore we do more output. But is that really the best way of getting them there? That's the question. And then the one that I'm definitely guilty of is output as a tangible outcome, the fruit of our labor. This is what we end up assessing. Input tends to be seen as the scaffolding as part of the process, and then output tends to see as a result of that process. Even good friends who do task-based language teaching, in a way, they're a little bit guilty of this, right? You do have maybe some interpretive assessments, but most of those tasks are output oriented, where the student needs to be creating with language. So this is another reason why we also end up favoring output in our classes. Now, what I have seen, though, is I think that over time, if you think about it, we did a little bit of history last time, right? So crashing in the early 80s with the comprehensible input hypothesis, and then you have Swain in mid-80s with the output hypothesis, and then we saw those puzzle pieces from Susan Gass in the later 80s trying to put it all together. But what I'm seeing now is that I think communicative language teaching also went through a lot of transformation. The original version of communicative language teaching was not about students talking all the time. And unfortunately, once again, output pulls us in. So we end up favoring output, and a lot of communicative language teaching has been transformed into students need to be talking, students need to be talking. And I think the pendulum swing that I saw with all of that favoring of output, especially in textbooks, is an overzealous defense of input. And so you see a lot of these movements with comprehensible input, input only, right? Only stories, TPRS, right? You see all of these, sort of the reaction to the other side. Yes, input needs to be defended, input needs to be understood, and it has to have a very important role in our teaching. But I think that we can't just say that one is good and the other one is bad. I think we need to be careful with some of the messages that are being passed around as if they were facts. We need to unpack them a little bit more to understand where that person is coming from. So for example, to say that output is just the result of a lot of input, implying that output plays absolutely no role in language development, well, not quite. Not everybody would agree with that, and we need to understand why output may be part of the process and may actually help with language development. To say things like output doesn't contribute to acquisition. Well, where's this coming from? My best guess is that how they're defining acquisition. So if you're defining acquisition as strictly building the system from data that you're getting from language that you are understanding, then yes, obviously that is all input. Only input does that. However, if we're looking at it, not just acquisition, but rather proficiency development, which is what I prefer rather than talk about acquisition. If we're talking about proficiency development, then I'm sorry, but output does play a role. So input perhaps helps to build the system, as in providing that data to establish those four meaning connections. But if we're talking about language development, proficiency development, then yes, we do need output to keep those connections strong and to build fluency and accuracy. So output does play a role. Now, when people just say, you know, and as I understand, it's social media, right? So you just say, oh, yeah, no, output doesn't contribute to acquisition. The issue that I see with that is that if we don't take the time to unpack where that statement is coming from, then somebody might misinterpret it and think, well, then output is useless, doesn't contribute, doesn't do anything. And it, not quite, right? So we need to make sure that we understand that we are informed in how we are processing information that is being shared by colleagues too. So last time I talked about several misconceptions regarding input. So today we're going to do the same, but misconceptions about output. The first one is very almost like the flip side of the input one, right? So the input is any exposure. We said myth. Same goes for output. Output is not any and all production. And this is where at the beginning that I said, well, no input, no output, that's a given, right? And why would somebody come back to me and say, well, but are you sure about it? The reason for it is because if you consider that output is any and all production, meaning you could just make sounds, well, yeah, you could make sounds without a linguistic system in your head, right? You could just imitate sounds. That's not what I mean by output. It's not what Swain meant by output. It's not what many of us in SLA mean by output. And so output is not any and all production. We're going to talk about that one a little bit more. Another misconception about output is that output is just the result of acquisition. And as I just said a little bit more, not quite. So again, if we're going with acquisition, defined very specifically as just what input does, which is build the system, okay. But output is part of the process. Let's just leave it at that, and then we'll look at what Swain's had to say about how it could contribute. And not just Swain, by the way, not just Swain, many more people agree that it could be part of the process. And then the last one, I think has to do maybe more of what I see in the classroom, right? And some of the misinterpretation of communicative language teaching is that output is forcing students to talk, to think that, well, if I'm observing a communicative language class, the students should be talking 90% of the time. That is not what anybody meant by output, and it doesn't necessarily reflect the role of output. So we'll unpack that misconception in just a minute. Let's start with the first one, right? The first one is that output is any and all production. And let's talk about production, language production, in a bit of a continuum, if you will. And this is a very simplified continuum. Some things may fall in a gray area right between them. So I think on the one extreme of the continuum, you have this production practice, things like read out loud, for repetition, copying sentences. Somewhere in the middle, you have this expressing meaning, but only for a pedagogical purpose. And what I mean by that is, for example, if you show them a series of pictures and students have to label them. No one's doing anything else with it. They're just labeling pictures just to kind of show you that they know what these words are. If you're just giving them a list of questions that they need to respond to so that you can assess whether they can respond those questions, it's still output for a pedagogical purpose. And then you have, I guess, the other extreme of the continuum, but there's a lot in between, which would be what ACTFL tends to call presentational and interpersonal tasks, where we don't have just meaningful production, meaningful and purposeful production. So we add a purpose to it that goes beyond a strictly pedagogical purpose, such as, let me assess how well you can answer the question. So to me, the middle and the other extremes, right? So anything that involves meaning to me is output. And that's how Swain defined it. That's how Van Patten would define it, right? It has to involve meaning. Purpose, geez, is debatable, right? To what extent does the purpose contribute? But at the very least, to be considered output is we need to be expressing meaning. Things like read out loud, core repetition, copying sentences is not what Swain meant by output. It's not what anybody meant by output. Is it one type of mechanical practice? Yes, just like, I guess, exposure to sounds could be one form of language exposure, but it's not input, right? We all agree that that is not input. And so here's where we get to some common objections, especially when I talk about reading out loud. And I know that reading out loud has a lot of fans. I don't want to get a lot of hate mail, but let's just unpack why we do different things, right? Or some of the objections that I usually get. So the first one is, even if it's a meaningless drill, some students might still pay attention to meaning. So even if all I'm doing is just repeat after me, even if all I'm doing is just read out loud this sentence, yes, technically it is meaningless. The student can do it without having any clue what they're saying. But hey, some students might still pay attention to meaning. The second objection that I get is, well, what about pronunciation practice, right? Well, you were doing reading out loud or repeat after me for pronunciation practice. In the case of certain languages, for handwriting practice. So if they need to learn a new alphabet, then yes, they need handwriting practice. And then the third objection, I'll tell you my responses in just a minute. The third objection is, well, but doesn't repeating the words help them remember them better? And here are my answers to each of these objections. So the first one is, I want students to develop communicative ability thanks to my approach, not in spite of it. So for me to adopt the cross your fingers and hope that somebody pays attention to meaning approach, that doesn't quite do it for me. I have very limited time with my students and I want to make the most of it as that I can, right? So I want to make sure that whatever we're doing is helping them make form meaning connections. So if there's a chance that what I'm doing doesn't involve meaning, it's not going to be form meaning connections, right? So that is something that I need to keep in mind because my goal is communicative ability. Very closely related, right? So the idea that, well, but they need pronunciation practice, they need handwriting practice. My response is a question back, which is, why not include meaning intentionally and purposeful in every activity? Even if your secret agenda is pronunciation practice, why not also include meaning? So those form meaning connections are always there. And then the one about if repeating the words helps you remember them, actually, that doesn't quite resonate with what research says. So if meaning is excluded, meaning won't be retained. So meaningless production of words does not help with vocab learning. Meaningless. Now, if the student has to retrieve the word in a meaningful way, then yes, they're going to be remembering what that word is. But if the student is strictly just copying, for example, or just strictly repeating sounds, that will not help the students remember what those words are. So the only way to establish form meaning connections is with meaning. The form is already there. We need meaning. So acquisition, grammar, vocab, whatever it is form meaning connections. Some of these forms are sounds, some of these forms are symbols or signs. You need the form and what meaning is attached to it. You make that connection. That is what drives acquisition. So why would we exclude meaning? Form is always there. It's always there. You cannot have meaning without form. Anytime you are expressing meaning, you're doing that through forms. However, you can, as many textbooks have shown us, you can have form without meaning, right? A lot of these meaningless drills, substitution drills, all of those that you can do without having any idea of what you're saying. Again, just the hoping that somebody's still paying attention to meaning, to me, is not good enough. I want to push them to be showing me that they're understanding every step of the way as much as I can, right? We talked about different levels of what is comprehensible, right, last time. And then pronunciation, handwriting practice. Hey, I understand, I get it. Some students need it, but make it meaningful. Why not? Why are we having them write something? To express a meaning at some point, right? Why are we having them pronounce a word? So that their meaning can be understood. So let's make it meaningful. What could that entail? Well, even something as labeling pictures, they need to be handwriting that, but at least they are retrieving that word for a meaning, to express a particular meaning. If you're having them choose from this or that, they're essentially repeating after you one of those items, right? But they're repeating after you and then with a preference, right? So they need to be paying attention to a particular item, the meaning. If you're having them rank things in order of preference, and then they need to read out loud that list, that is reading out loud, but it's meaningful. They rank them first. They pay attention to the meaning of those words. There's lots of ways of doing meaningful dictation, which would definitely help with handwriting practice, even if you're not doing handwriting practice. Like in Spanish, we don't do handwriting practice, but dictation can help a lot in terms of the spelling of words, in terms of noticing form, because when the student sees something written down, and also connecting it to what the word sounds like, that is all very good for language development, and they notice different things in the input they may not notice in strictly oral input. Now, I'm not talking about, when I talk about, including meaning and output and all that, the repeat after me, I'm not talking about what I call the illusion of output. Now, I can see if you think, well, but repeat after me or read out loud gives us the illusion of people producing language. But to me, the illusion of output is more like when we have to meet these external expectations of why aren't students talking? Have you ever been observed? You can put in the chat, but have you ever been observed and felt this pressure of someone observing your class and be like, well, I probably should have the students talk more, or my observer is not going to like that? Have you ever had an experience like that? You can type in the chat. Yes, Jenna. All the time. Oh, wow. Okay. That, yes. So it's very common in all levels, right? So this is not just K-12, this is not just higher ed. We all have this expectations, this pressure that the student should be talking, the student should be talking, the student should be talking. And sometimes we, as trained professionals, know my students are not ready to be talking all the time. They cannot handle be talking all the time. And then you also then have the internal struggle of, whoa, but they're not using the target language, right? You get into this whole thing of this fight for different expectations. And that is because if the students are just simply not advanced, it's going to be really hard for the students to be talking a lot in the target language. So then this is where I think the illusion of output sometimes comes up. Or comes in handy. I'm sorry, it's been a long day. Comes in handy. And that is when the students look like they're talking, they look like they're interacting, but actually it is all input. They call it input dressed as output. So essentially, these are activities that you can take as ideas from presentational or interpersonal ideas, but you make them interpretive. Any idea can be interpretive if you are the one providing the language. So a lot of what we talked about last time in terms of what to do with input, you can make it look as a presentational activity. You can make it look like an interpersonal activity, but it's not really interpersonal. It's not really presentational because the student is not producing language. The student is merely recycling, repeating language that you gave them, but they're demonstrating that they understood to be able to do that. The couple of examples that I have come from Common Ground. This one is actually in chapter 3 of Common Ground. Chapter 3 is input. So it's called class surveys. And when you hear class surveys, you might be tempted to think, well, class surveys, the students are producing, talking, interacting. This is actually an input activity that can be done as an input activity because you prepare the questions. Perhaps you even prepare choices. So then all the student is doing is reading the question aloud and then stating their choice. So the students are not creating anything with language. They're not retrieving anything from their heads. They are only demonstrating that they are understanding the language presented to them. So the students can still be going around, the students can still be talking. All of that, it maybe could be level of agreement or disagreement, number scales, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? So you can tweak it in any way that is what can the students handle at this point. It could be just one name, right? Brands, places, celebrities, right? So it doesn't always have to be completely like choices and you give it to them. Maybe even some novice learners can handle certain things like seasons, colors, right? There could be some things that they are retrieving from their head, but the vast majority of what you're asking them to do is provided for them. And so that is an input activity. This is one way that you can make it look like as the students are talking, but in reality, you gave them all of the language. The other example comes from chapter 4, which is interpretive communication. And then this one is a, sorry, somebody else. This one is an asynchronous interview. So in this case, you will be the whole example. I'm just giving you the blurb, but the full example is developed in Common Ground. So the students are given the questions or choosing from a series of questions. So again, they're choosing from, that means they're demonstrating which question, understanding which question they want to ask. All they're doing is reading that question out loud, they're recording it, and then the interviewer is the one recording the answer. So the student needs to then prepare a short report, which can be done in the shared language, English, for example, in the US. And then the student is just demonstrating that they're understanding the language. So even though it may look like an interview because there was a question and answer, this is entirely interpretive communication. So what we mean by output is not just the students reading something out loud, just the students speaking or talking, right? What we mean is expressing meaning. So if the student is just, I think Patton said, right, if they're just making sounds with their mouth, right, that is not enough for it to be called output. They need to be expressing meaning. And so the two key questions are, could it be done without paying attention to meaning? Could the student do it without understanding, without knowing what they're saying? That is the key question of output. But then there's another second question that is only applicable to output, not to input, and that is the student retrieving from their linguistic system? And this is the question that sometimes we don't ask ourselves enough, but it goes back to that illusion of output, right? So is the student retrieving from their own head, or is the student merely repeating from another source? So let me clarify one thing about retrieving from where, because some people might think, well, but my students don't have a linguistic system in their head just yet. I get it. It takes some time to develop a linguistic system. Now, and there's nothing wrong, inherently wrong with retrieving from memory. A lot of what we do is retrieve from memory, especially at the novice level, right? So memorize is not inherently bad. Repeating from an external source. So for example, only reading from a vocab list. Hey, which one of these is your favorite fruits? But the student is just repeating from a vocab list with the pictures or with the translations. Then in that case, it is not output. Doesn't mean that it's good or bad. Doesn't mean that it's good or bad. It just means that it's not output because the student is not retrieving from their memory. It's not retrieving from their system. It's not retrieving from anywhere except an external source. And I understand why the word memorized sometimes tends to have negative connotations. And that is because probably if we're thinking about audiolingualism, right, where we had to memorize dialogues and then repeat from memory, even some grammar translation, there was some memorization going on, memorization of vocab, right? All of these things have gained sort of this bad rap and just negative connotation that it's not communication or that it's not proficiency. But when you think about it, when you even read the proficiency guidelines, memorized chunks is indeed what novice high students produce. And even intermediate low, a lot of it is they're starting to put things together, but a lot of it is from memory. Just stored in memory, unanalyzed, meaning that they cannot tell you exactly why you say it that way. It's just there. It did not come from a system that is creating with the language. That is not a bad thing. It is not a bad thing. It is perfectly okay for novice learners to be producing memorized language, for them to be repeating after you sometimes. I get it. It's just part of all they can handle because they do not have a system built just yet. So if all they're doing is just retrieving from memory, that is still good. We need to keep those connections strong. So they need to be retrieving from their own memory. Now, once again, if they're just repeating question you gave them to ask, it's input, maybe input, but it is not output, right? And why does it matter? Why is it something that I'm insisting on so much? Because if it's not really output, we cannot expect it to have the benefits of output. It doesn't mean that it's good. It doesn't mean that it's bad. It just means it's not output. So if your students are simply not ready for output, so all you're doing is input, that's okay. But It's your thinking that you're doing output, because in the assessment, you're going to push them for real output. They may not be ready there because they had almost no chance of producing output in a low stakes way. So that's just something to think about, is how much are they doing actual output in class if the assessment is going to require actual. So let's look at this example here. I don't need to translate it because there's a lot already provided there for you. So I'll give you a minute to look at it and tell me, what do you think about it? Is it output? You can tell me more if you want. You don't have to just tell me that. But is it output is my main question. You can type in the chat. Okay, I'm seeing a lot of no's. I'm seeing it's input. Right, so what do we have here? We're providing the students with everything, right? We're providing the students with everything. The student is not retrieving from their heads, so this is not output. Very good, excellent. Right, so it doesn't matter if you're just doing a picture. It doesn't matter if you're doing the full-on translation. You're still giving them everything they need to use and recombine to look like they're talking, but it's not output. It's just not output. The other thing that, you know, we could critique from this particular activity as is that it doesn't seem to have a purpose, right? Why are they asking each other if they like those fruits? What are they doing with that information? It's not clear what anyone is doing with this information. So that's the other thing that I would revise from this activity, whether it is input or whether it is output. I need to give the students a purpose for needing this information. So once again, just want to clarify. So yeah, if they're novice learners, they're just not ready to be asking each other free-flowing questions. I get it. It's not all or nothing, good or bad. It is simply a matter of, what am I targeting with this? The students definitely do need scaffolding, input, useful phrases, the chat maps, the word walls, all of that. Yes, absolutely, they do. If you don't have a system in your head yet, if you don't remember the words yet, how are you going to do that? Right. So, of course, you need that to the point where you're like, okay, you know what? I don't need to be looking at the chat mat anymore. I don't need to be looking at the word wall. I don't need to be looking at the vocab in the textbook because it's already here. Right. So I get it. It's not about good or bad. It's not about good or bad. The question we do need to ask ourselves is, are we gradually taking the training wheels off? So if a student is over-reliant on these useful tools that we're giving them to the point that they simply cannot retrieve anything on their own, then we need to think about, you know, they're still a novice low when it comes to output, right? Because there's just nothing there. So we need to think about, to what extent are we pushing the students to try to remember, to try to retrieve from their system? It's going to be uncomfortable at first. It's going to be frustrating at first. It's frustrating even for me right now when I don't remember a word in English. But it's just part of being a language learner, right? That sometimes the brain just cannot retrieve that information. But we have to keep those connections strong. And the only way of building fluency and proficiency is pushing them slowly and gradually to be retrieving from their own system. So we need to think about, to what extent are we providing opportunities that are scaffolded, safe, you know, good, not too terribly frustrating, for the students to express meaning to the best of their own abilities, not aiming for always complete sentences, not aiming for perfection, not aiming for perfect pronunciation, none of that, just to their own, the best of their own abilities. If we are using those chat mats and word walls and phrases and everything because we are aiming for something higher, then I would say take it back. Expect a little lower, but on their own, right? So it's a little bit of the assisted better, unassisted a little lower, and that's okay, right? And that's okay because we want them to feel better on their own and not always needing the external help always, right? So do they need it at the beginning? Of course. So let's look at a few other examples of activities. This one's all in English, of course. Pretend that what the teacher is giving them is in the target language, but I'll give you a minute to read them. I don't like reading out loud. And then you tell me what you think about it. Type in the chat your thoughts on this activity. Is it okay? We have a yes, but then we have an input vote. Okay. So another vote for input. It's interpretive, it's input. Okay, yes, this is indeed an input activity, right? All the students are doing is showing understanding. Who produced the story? Whose output is it? The teacher, right? This is only an output activity for the teacher, but not for the students. The teacher was the one who wrote the stories. So the first student needs to be understanding, asking the teacher for clarification if they need to, and then also to confirm whether the drawings make sense. And then the other student is also demonstrating comprehension only by drawing it, but no one is retrieving meaning from their own heads. Everything is coming from someone else, from an external resource. So very good. This is a comprehension activity. Again, not good or bad. What are we targeting? This is comprehension. Now, what if we tweak it? So let's read this tweaked version of the activity. Okay, so now we see the difference. Do we all see the difference? Yep. So now we tweaked it. Now we tweaked it. Now the student has to add from their own, to the best of their own ability, has to add to the story. So yes, they need to understand what's happening. Of course, they do need to understand what's happening. Same with step two. Step two is still one student understanding the other. But yes, when they're adding to the student, to the story, not to the student, when they're adding to the story, that is output. So now we made it into a little bit of more of a scaffolded output activity. They're still expressing meaning, and they're expressing meaning that someone else is going to have to do something with it. So this is to show that it doesn't always have to do an all or nothing, meaning that step one doesn't have to be a student writes a story. Some students are not ready to write an entire story, right? And that's okay. So you as the teacher know what they can handle. What can they retrieve on their own? So then you as the teacher know to tweak the activity with how many blanks, where are the blanks, where they need to add, right? But they're retrieving something to the best of their own abilities. And that is a little bit of that targeted output that is going to get them eventually to maybe, yeah, there's more and more blanks, and eventually you write the story. But it's okay to have something in the middle where the student is not producing the entire story. It is still output. Okay, let's take a look at this activity. So this is from a French textbook. I promise I did not crop anything out. This was the entire activity. I'll translate it real quick. Don't ask me to pronounce this in French. My high school French teacher would not be proud of me. So with a classmate, with a partner, write at least 10 sentences describing this house. And you have the example. When you enter the house, the bathroom is the bathroom is, oh gosh, is that to the right? No, to the left. Yeah, to the left. Thank you. To the left of the door, but the bureau, that's the office, right? Like an office space. This to the Right. Go. Thank you. Thank you very much. You're very encouraging teachers here. Okay, so is it output? Okay, Stephanie, we have an answer from Stephanie. Yes, it's output. Output because you have to produce a description. Yeah. Can they do it without knowing what they're saying? No, right? There's a meaning involved. They need to be understanding what's happening to be able to write this description. Okay. So yes, it is output. Now, is there anything you would change out of this activity? Is there anything that you feel could be improved from this activity? Practice. Okay. That is a good question. It's true that there were other activities I'm not showing you, right? But of this activity, what is the communicative goal, the purpose? Is Laura, Stephanie? Absolutely. Yes. Is there a purpose, Christine? I don't know. I don't see one. The only purpose that I see here is practicing. Probably practicing the vocab words, probably practicing prepositions, right? It seems like the only purpose is practicing. Okay, so let's see if we have a suggestion already. Okay, they could draw and label the rooms of the house instead of looking at the drawing provided. Okay, so maybe one way of changing it could potentially be if one person writes the description and another person has to draw it based on that description, or even maybe even label the rooms, right? Label the rooms according to the picture. All of that would at least add this purpose that goes beyond just strict practicing, where everyone's going to end up with the same description, and then we all look at each other as I'm like, okay, I guess we're done, right? At least there's something else, right? The way that oh, there's another one. Hang on. They can make a list of what they're looking for and decide if they want to buy it, right? Yep, exactly, right? So maybe somebody can do a description of a house. Maybe this house, maybe you don't need the blueprint necessarily, but then the other person can say whether that's a house they would be interested in or not. Yeah, that's exactly right. So that's what I mean by the purpose of output, right? So the idea that someone's output is someone else's input, and they need to do something with it. Not just I wrote it, you wrote it, we're going to stare at each other because we have the same house, the same description. But why am I sharing it with you? Why am I sharing it with a class? Why am I even writing this? I have a few ideas. You had great ideas in the chat. A few ideas that I have here would be, let's say you want to use the blueprint of the house, right? You don't have time to be changing it, anything like that. So one alternative, which is pretty low prep, would be something like each student is assigned in secret a number of differences. So for example, from 0 to 5, so some students get 0, some students get 2, 1, 4, 5, right? And then those are the number of differences that they need to purposefully include in their description, between their description and the picture and the blueprint of this house. And I don't mean errors, I mean actual differences, right? So maybe the bathroom is to the right of the door instead of the lift. That would be one difference between the description of the house and the blueprint of the house. And some students are going to get 0, which means it needs to match exactly as is. So then what do you do with it? Well, it could be that somebody reads it and then other people have to say how many differences. So what secret number they got. Or you could do it as gallery walk, and then everybody posts their descriptions. The students need to be reading it, looking at the picture, comparing, and figuring out how many differences there were. Another alternative would be something similar. You're still using just this one picture, but you do more of a memory game. So you have the students write some sentences about this house. I don't know, not necessarily you have 10 sentences, but just a few sentences about this house. And maybe some of them need to be true, some of them need to be false. You give the students a few minutes to try to visually memorize the picture as much as possible, put the picture away, and see who remembers that to be saying true or false based only on visual memory. It doesn't have to be just true false. It could be something like this room is next to the salon, right? And then they have to say which room it is, again, based on visual memory. Another alternative would involve slightly different plans. So maybe you can do something similar, but then edit it. So you change the location of some of the things. And then you do like a gallery walk picture matching, right? So that they have to have a description and the different pictures and make sure that they find the corresponding picture that goes with the corresponding description. Okay. So the other misconception that I talked about before is that output is just the result. This is a misconception in my eyes, in the eyes of Swen, in the eyes of many other people, simply because we see output as having a role in proficiency development. Not saying acquisition on purpose, as I already covered, right? So output is not just the result, it's not what magically appears, but rather output could contribute to that fluency development, proficiency development. And that is precisely what Swain's output hypothesis was all about. It wasn't about output is better. It wasn't about output is necessary. It was simply to state that output is part of the process, that it's not all you need is input and strictly just input, and then magically output appears, but rather output could indeed and does indeed play a part in proficiency development. What does it do? And there's still people who sustain that this is exactly what output does, is it strengthens form meaning connections by honing access, the skill of accessing the system. So you have the acquisition portion of it, which is a little bit more of that mental representation, the building the system in your head. But then a lot of what we do with language requires us to access that system. So you access it faster, and that's part of fluency, through very strong form meaning connections, and that output can definitely help with that. Another sort of indirect way in which output contributes to developing the system is that it might help with input processing. So that means that when you're trying to say something, that is where you become the most aware of what you don't know yet, or you only partially know about the target language. Sometimes when we are understanding someone, we can do that without paying a lot of attention to the details of the language. Not always, but a lot of the time, right? And so this is why sometimes, we understand a lot more than we can say. So when we're trying to say something, that's when we realize a little bit of the shortcomings of our system, right? Of the parts where the connections are not very strong here. And so when we realize that something we want to say, we don't know how to say it, we're not sure how to say it, it sort of primes us to pay more attention to it in future input. Whether that input is immediate, meaning that our interlocutor provides it for us, or whether we just don't know, but then eventually we notice it down the line, as I'm sure it has happened to you as a language learner, right? That you were trying to say something you didn't know. Well, during that particular exchange, you just kept going, expressed it in another way. And then later on, you see that word, you see that structure and go, oh, that's what it was. So it sort of primes us, that need to want to communicate something. And even Van Patten, who is known for input, has this quote, which I love and sometimes surprises people. But it says the initial stages of learning should be comprehension oriented. Notice that it says oriented, not exclusive, oriented. However, a steady diet of comprehension only throughout one's language learning experience does not maximize acquisition. He used the word acquisition. Acquisition, if you mean it as proficiency development, language development, then yes, I fully agree with that, right? That it is absolutely true that output could help with it. Of course, we need to have realistic expectations of input and output at different stages of the development process. So the initial stages, yes, we need to be doing a lot more input, or this output illusion, right? The input dressed as output, but put a lot more emphasis on this, giving them the language so that they see those same structures, those same words over and over and over again, to the point where they don't need us to give it to them. So that's a little bit of what we're getting, and that way they can retrieve on their own. The third misconception is that output is about forcing students to talk. And this misconception has two parts, the part of forcing and the part of talking. Let me get to the forcing part first. So this idea that we need to force students or push students to produce language, well, rushing to output can indeed be detrimental. Now, I know that I say we gradually need to be taking the training wheels off, and we do, but there's a difference between pushing yourself to express what you want to say to the best of your abilities versus being completely shoved out of your comfort zone. So I think that we need to be giving them a lot of this input and a lot of this safety, that they feel safe, that they can accomplish the task. But at some point, they need to be accomplishing the task without the training wheels. That doesn't mean that you need to rush to output. We definitely need to give them plenty of opportunities to develop a system in the first place. You cannot develop the skill of accessing something that is not there yet. So we definitely need to help them build a system first. The problem with rushing to output is that students likely conclude I'm bad at languages and they just ask Google to translate something for them, right? The part about the I'm bad at languages to me is what breaks my heart, right? Because sometimes it's not that the student is bad at languages. It's simply that they were asked to do something they were not quite ready for. And sometimes it's because of institutional pressures, which I know all too well. But sometimes it's just the student not fully understanding how slow and complicated language acquisition really is. So the fact that, yes, for a long time, all they can say is some words and some phrases, and they feel a lot of this frustration of not knowing how to say everything they want to say. Yeah, that is absolutely part language learning. That is the beauty of language learning. It doesn't mean that we are bad at languages. We need to be patient. We need to be patient when it comes to going from input to output. There was a comment before about more practice before output. We need to make sure that we are giving them a lot more and that we have realistic and very slow expectations of moving from input to output. And I love this quote by Susan Gass. So she said there is a lot of mileage that needs to be traveled between the input to the learner and what the learner produces. We cannot assume that with mere presentation of language information, whether implicitly or explicitly, that means whether you're telling stories or whether you're explaining how the language works, students will convert it to output. They won't. Not for a while. Not for a while. We need to build that system, and that takes time. Remember, we saw it last time, right? That it's not just a comprehensible input, but only a subset of that subset eventually gets acquired. So it's going to take a long time, a lot of mileage, that goes from making those for meaning connections to storing them, to integrate them into a system where they can then retrieve from. Okay, so the third and final misconception is that not talking means not learning. Oh, no, I'm sorry. This is not the third one. It's been a long day. This is the talking part of the forcing students to talk. So we need to bust this myth once and for all about not talking equals not learning. Just because the students are not talking doesn't mean they're not learning. I understand once again that frustration of the external pressure of being observed or being evaluated yourself, and have to show students talking. And sometimes you feel it, right? Maybe it's not just external. Maybe you feel it, like it's too quiet and you feel like the classroom is too quiet, but someone else's classroom is always really loud. What am I doing wrong? It's just this idea that talking and learning go together. That's not always the case. There's a lot of talking that happens in silence. There's a lot of talking, language processing that happens when the students are not talking. And not just input, but also output. There's definitely unique advantages of written input and output. The students notice, research has consistently shown the students focus more on form. They have more time to edit, right? So there's a lot of good things that happen with written input, whether it is you're reading something or whether it is you're writing something. I think that this is something that we need to be doing more with novice level students. Sometimes I feel like there's so much pressure on the conversation side of languages that we feel that, no, they don't need to write because I'm here for them to be able to talk. But actually, being able to write is also being really good for being able to talk. So we can be separating the modalities altogether and thinking that one is not going to influence the other. And then when it comes to not talking in the sense of being silent, listening, right? Listening is also a wonderful way for language acquisition. But if we're focusing on just output, then yes, writing, I think, is something that we need to be incorporating more. I don't think there's anything wrong with novice learners, even intermediate low, to have that time to retrieve in writing first, and then they can share with the class, right? So to be giving them that breather of being able to self-edit, to lower that anxiety of having to participate, if you will, in class, in associating participation always with spontaneous oral production. It doesn't have to be that way, right? There's a lot of good things about written output. Now, what Swain called pushed output is sometimes what gets misinterpreted as this idea of forcing students to talk. And perhaps it was an unfortunate name for it, but she called it pushed output. But let's clarify what she meant by pushed output. Pushed output was never meant to be perfection from day one, and was never meant to be about forcing students to talk. Also, it's not about rushing to output. It wasn't about that either. Now, essentially, what Swain was saying is the same idea that Krashen had with I+1, but O+1, right? So that this idea that students should be encouraged, challenged, if you will, to expand, push, stretch. I think she called it stretch their interlanguage, right? So to try to express meaning to the best of their abilities, and a little more, right? So that we're not always accepting good enough forever and ever, right? So it's good enough for their level at this time, yes. Did they give me a little more? Great. I'm not going for perfection. I'm not going for perfect, complete sentences each and every time. But if I know that they can handle it, then pushing them to get there. So this idea that it's a challenge, but it's achievable, right? So aiming for growth without too many growing pains. There's going to be some growing pains. That's part of language learning. We are getting outside of our comfort zones. We are going to get frustrated at times, is part of it. But the idea is not to frustrate them to the point where they conclude on bad languages, to the point that they do no longer enjoy learning the language. It's more of this, I can't quite do it now, but I might be able to do it tomorrow, right? So not quite able yet, but I'm getting there. So how can we help the students? How can we set them up for success? There's 3 tips that I give, which is pretty general, if you will. It's always going to depend on the task at hand, but just to have an idea of things that we should keep in mind when designing output activities. So the first one is to mirror this idea of teach to the test. You've heard of teach to the test, which means that whatever test you have in mind, you're doing this backwards planning. You are teaching them so that they can accomplish that. Very similarly, input to the output. What type of output are you expecting out of your students? Hopefully realistic output. Then make sure that you provide a lot of that input that is going to be very useful for that output. And that means that it needs to be recent, relevant, and the students need to be actively engaged with it. This is absolutely true for novice students. I think a lot of teachers who teach the lower levels, they do know, well, yeah, no, they're going to need a lot more input, but students don't stop needing input after a certain level. Even advanced students, if they're working on how to do argumentation, how do you know? You know, no one's born knowing how to do it, right? So this is something that we learn from the input. Graduate students writing research papers, how do you know? From reading a lot of research papers, right? So a lot of this is coming from the input. So we all still need input. It doesn't mean that it stops. What do I mean by recent, relevant, and actively engaged with it? I'm going to show you an example in a minute. But essentially, you have to have in mind a specific type of output. If it's an infographic, make sure they did a lot of things with infographics. If it's a menu, make sure they saw a lot of menus. If it is a restaurant review, lots of things with restaurant reviews. Not just, here's an example, because I would not be very active and wouldn't be enough, right? And it's not about, remember that thing we saw last year? that's not recent enough, right? In the system, and make sure that it is relevant. So maybe yes, you did your food, fruits, vegetables, beverages, all of that, and now write a restaurant review. Those are very different genres, right? Just a menu and a restaurant review are not written the same way. So make sure everything is directly connected to the type of output that you expect. The second tip is related to something that we've been discussing already, this idea of a purpose, of a goal. Start with a goal before you get into, oh, I want them to write a restaurant review. Why? What will others do with it? Consider the audience, right? Anytime we're doing output, we're hoping there's an audience right on the other side. And so what is the audience going to do with it? And this is what I said before. Someone's output is someone else's input, and they need to do something with it. Many times, I do this myself. I'm the only audience. I get it, right? You want the students to write something, to be assessing them, so you end up being the only one who reads it. I get it. But as much as you can, try to think of a way that the students are producing language, not just share it with the class, which sometimes some students pay attention and others don't. But rather, we're going to do something with it. This is something that your classmate is going to need to be able to do XYZ, right? So there's something someone is doing with it. And then the last tip would be to avoid extremes. Avoid giving them just a prompt or topic, such as talk about your favorite holidays, especially if you're talking about intermediate law and lower, right? Novice students. This is too overwhelming, right? They do not know where to begin other than to say my favorite holiday is, and then they may struggle to say, I don't know what else to say, right? And also because your expectations are not fully clear to the student, right? In terms of how much, what do you want me to talk about, right? For some students, it comes natural to develop a topic. For many students, it does not. So I think that we need to be careful in just giving a topic and then hoping that they read our minds and understand what we're expecting. And then the other extreme would be something very controlled or contrived, where you're putting language before message. And so it becomes something like use complete sentences, at least two irregular verbs, different vocabularies, include one suggestion for your partner using the subjunctive. At that point, it becomes a checklist that students go through to try to meet all of these demands, right? To try to fulfill demands. But then that takes precedent over, here's what I wanted to say about my favorite holiday. And so we need to make sure that we are letting go of control, that we are scaffolding, but we are not controlling their output. So this is an example that comes from Common Ground, and this is chapter 5 on presentational. And so in this case, you see that steps 1 and 2 are input oriented. So the students are reading descriptions of items for sale, which is exactly what they're going to have to be doing later. And then they match the description with a picture of the item. They're doing something input-based, comprehension-based with that input. So it's not just, here's a sample, but rather we're doing comprehension activities with this input. And this input is also what's going to help you with your output. Step 2 is a little bit more of identifying the genre, right? What kind of information is typically included? What kinds of words or phrases are typically used? Then the students start writing. So in steps 3 and 4, you can include students sharing ideas in small groups, depending on if your students can handle that. If you feel like they can really provide a lot of feedback to each other, that's fine. You don't always have to have peer feedback, but it does help when it comes to generating content, right? It doesn't always have to be about them correcting each other's language, which rarely, if ever, happens. I even have an article about that. The percentage errors that they detect is extremely small. So think about peer feedback more in terms of generating content. And then in steps 5 and 6 is where you have that follow-up, or the so what, or the what will others do with it, right? So the students write it, they share it, and the classmates need to indicate how much they would pay for the item based on the description. So you have this idea of someone's output is someone else's input, and they need to do something with it. And then this idea of starting with a goal, making sure that it's purposeful, making sure that they got input, all of that it still goes for interpersonal. It's not just for presentational. So we need to start with the goal. Why are they exchanging this information? What will they do with it? Before they interact, we need to set them up for success, right? So we need a lot of preparation materials. Of course, needless to say, interpersonal being the trickiest of all the modes needs to happen after a lot of input and very scaffolded output, right? They're not going to be quite ready for full-on interpersonal without a lot of this preparation, especially at the beginning. And then after they interact, this is where you tie it back to your goal, right? Why are they exchanging the info? So this was the whole point of it, right? So maybe it's to make a recommendation, to draw a conclusion, to confirm something. Here's the example that I can give you. I did this one with a group of students. I was doing a campus interview, and so I was new to the area, so it became borderline authentic. So I asked them, help me find a house to rent. This is going to be the purpose. So I prepared several possible ads that they needed to read. And then based on those ads, then think about questions that you're going to ask me. So maybe things about pets, the location, the cost, the shape the house was in, different things like that, house versus apartments, things like that. The students prepare the questions. They had time in groups to think about what are they going to ask me. I think that this is important as opposed to jumping straight to the interaction and then sort of dying after one question. They interviewed me in this case, but depending on how you're setting it up, this is something that you could do with students. And then the follow-up, right? The why did we get this information would be to give a recommendation. In this case, they had to give me plan A, plan B, in case plan A was not available. So what they thought it would be the best house and the second best for me to rent, and why, demonstrating that they understood the information that I provided in when they interviewed me. Here's another example, and this one is a little different. They're interviewing each other, but this one is framed as a prediction confirmation activity. This comes from chapter 1 of Common Ground. So you see in step 1, it is very structured and relatively minimal, the output that the student is producing. So we are heavily scaffolding things. We're giving them time to think about this vocabulary, the structures. They're making some predictions. In step 2, they're creating the questions. And yes, it's okay for students to write questions. It's still interpersonal because they don't know what their classmate is necessarily going to ask them. And then in step 3, they interviewed their classmate, confirm predictions or not, and then how well do you know your classmate or not. So we by framing it as a prediction confirmation, we are starting with a goal and we are wrapping it up right at the end, make sure that they exchange the information for a purpose. Now, when you think about something like this that you might see in a textbook, it is labeled interpersonal speaking. This is a new textbook published last year, right? So they're using these ACTFL labels of interpersonal speaking. However, when you think about it, I'll translate it so you understand. Sorry, it's all in Spanish. So it says, in pairs, talk about an anecdote that you had with your best friend. And it says, help your classmate with these questions. Who's your friend? What is he or she like? Why are you friends? I don't know why it says, why are you friends? But that's one of the questions. Where were you when the story happened? When was it? What happened? How did you feel? Now, what is the interaction going to look like? If this is what the students have to do, what do you think the interaction is going to look like if you were a student in this case? Or if you can picture your own students doing this, what is likely going to happen? Seems one way, right? Most likely, yep. They will read the questions and answer. I'm not even sure that, I think interview is if we get lucky. I think most likely they're going to go down the list themselves and just answering the questions. So it's going to be, I talk, you talk, and we say how interesting. And then I guess then we look at the ceiling, right? it feels like if everyone asks the questions, then I'm going to give you the answers to the questions. That's almost a monologue, right? It might look like an interview in the sense that one person is going to read the questions and the other one answers. But there's not going to be a whole lot of meaningful back and forth. And many students are just going to resort to giving the answers, and the other student nods along. There's also nothing they need to do with this information. So if I'm talking with someone, my students, I can almost guarantee you, if my students are talking with a classmate and the classmate says something that they don't understand and they don't need that information for anything, they are not going to put their classmate on the spot. In fact, it happened in a very funny way. It didn't happen to me, but it happened to one of our TAs. The student was saying in Spanish that they eat cat for Thanksgiving. And the poor partner, I think maybe could tell, like, I don't think that's the word, but did not put the partner on the spot. Didn't want to make their partner nervous. So all the poor other students said was, oh, how interesting. So it became a dialogue about how they eat cat, and the other person said, how interesting. So this is what happens usually when you have this is what happens when you have two interlocutors that are relatively low level talking with each other, right? There isn't an interlocutor to rely on for feedback, to rely on for help, to rely on for negotiation. All of that goes out of the window because simply they do not have the skills for it. And also, even if they can tell that some word doesn't make sense, is this affective side of interaction that they do not want to make their partner nervous. They do not want to question their partner where they themselves feel like learners, right? So it's a dynamic that it doesn't always contribute to the best aspects of interaction, which is a lot of this negotiation of meaning. So an activity like this, we're just giving a prompt and questions, is not purposeful interaction, right? It's not purposeful interpersonal speaking. This is strictly going to be most likely students taking turns talking, right? And that's not enough for it to be considered interpersonal speaking. So before we go, I do want to say a few words about assessing output. Because a lot of what we do, as I said before, and I'm guilty of it, and I think is almost inevitable, right? That we want to assess students' skills based on how much they can say, how much they can write, how much they can express. So a lot of our assessments are indeed output-based. The way that I think we should be doing all assessments, if we are communicative, if we are proficiency-based, all we're doing in class is proficiency-informed assessment of performance. What does this mean? That means that what we ask them to do and what we do in class go hand in hand, and that is indeed performance. We are preparing students for this performance. So there has to be a link. It's not going to be in a proficiency assessment in the classic sense of proficiency assessments, but the guidelines, the proficiency guidelines, is what is informing our targets and our rubrics. So this is why it is proficiency informed, but we are assessing performance. So there's really no need to be saying, well, I do performance, I don't do proficiency. I do proficiency, I don't do performance. I think in every class, we are doing performance. Of course we are. How we grade them, that has to be coming from an informed place based on proficiency guidelines, based on these realistic expectations. So going back to what we started with at the beginning of the first session, what is our goal, right? What is our goal? We need to make this shift, which took me a while, but it's probably the most important shift that I had to make. And that is, I'm not here to assess or to aim for correct use of structures and vocab taught. I'm here to assess successful communication at their level. I'm giving you the tools that you need, but if you get there in another way and you still get there and it's still successful at your level, then I don't think students should be penalized for that, right? So my goal is not correct use of structures and vocab. My goal is successful communication at their level. So an example of a culminating writing task that would be performance-based but integrated within the course. So the students are writing an email to an exchange student. This doesn't happen in one and done, as many assessments are, but rather we're going to be working on it throughout the course. So it becomes sort of a target goal for the course. So as the students learn to talk about their routine, to talk about their town, to talk about their friends, to talk about their food, whatever it is, they add a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more to this email. So at the end of the course, they will have a more fully formed email, but they need to be writing a little bit as they go. The pros of doing something like this is built-in revision, because sometimes we do assessments, we collect it, we give feedback, and it all dies there, right? But in this case, the students keep revisiting, keep rereading what they wrote. So as they hopefully progress in their language journey, they can notice different things and maybe add to it, maybe revise them. Also, as you plan your course, the selection of content is informed by this overarching goal. So if there's something in the textbook that you're like, why would I need this? They're not going to be talking about it in this email. Then that already helps you figure out this is useful versus this is not so useful for us right now. And I think it reinforces this holistic view of language, which is at the core of proficiency-based teaching, right? That we're not teaching just to know these words or just to know these structures, or to know these bits of language, but rather we use this system, this language, as a tool for communication. Another example is a culminating interview, and I have both examples, the writing task and the interview, fully developed in the Language Educator issue of fall 2022. So if you go to the ACFL site and you go to the Language Educator, which is their magazine, they always choose sample articles from each issue, which you can read whether you are an ACFL member or not. So the sample article for fall 2022 was the article I wrote about this cohesive summative assessments. So if you want to read both examples fully developed, you can read them there. And then the other thing that we need to, of course, address is our expectations of success. What do we consider successful performance at level for the mode, modality, and task conditions? And as we said before, we have the input and the output. We know they're going to be doing much higher at input. They're understanding more that they can produce. So we need to have realistic expectations that maybe this is what the picture looks like, that maybe you are aiming higher for interpretive, you're challenging them higher for interpretive, and you're lowering your expectations, if you will, or at least expecting a lower level for interpersonal. And there's nothing wrong with that. You're not doing something wrong. The students are not doing something wrong. This is language development. It is simply much, much more difficult cognitively to do interpersonal than to do interpretive. And then when it comes to grades, the one thing that I think about is what is going to be my 100%, and I'm sticking to it. My students, at least, are very grade motivated. So I can give them good feedback all day long, but if they lost points, they lost points. And that is what they fixate on. If I lost points means I fell short. And so I had to rewrite my rubrics to think about who is a target. What is my target? If my target is novice high, my target is novice high. Novice high is 100%. It means that you sustained performance at target. So at level might be just this small cupcake with some frosting and M&Ms, and that is all they can handle. That is all they can handle. I'm going to give that student 100%. If a student went above and beyond and even gave me candles, that is beautiful. Like maybe they're going for intermediate low, but my target was novice high. You still get 100%. I'm not penalizing one student just because someone else went above and beyond. For people that are below, students that are performing below, so maybe they gave me the cupcake, but they put the candle next to it. So revise and resubmit. Right? This is about learning. This is not about a one-time, you either fail or succeed. Revise and resubmit, add some frosting and put the candle on top. How about that? Right? So give them some tools where they can indeed revise and resubmit and be successful. But I think if we don't have these realistic expectations, when it comes to their output, especially, this is where the students get frustrated and then think, I'm not good at languages. I'm not good at baking cakes. You're just not there yet. Doesn't mean you're bad at baking cakes. This is exactly at level for your expertise, for how much time you had, for the resources provided, etc. Right? This is what I'm aiming for, and you accomplished it. And the students find that extremely rewarding. I gave a different talk, and even some of the comments that the students made, the students found it motivating. It was not demotivating for them to be getting 100%. So we need to think about what messages we're sending with our rubrics, and then what messages we're sending with the grades that the students are getting. The issue that I have with this idea of having exceed expectations in the rubrics is not just me, by the way. There's other people out there. My colleague Jude Krasnowski gave a great webinar on rubrics that I'm happy to share the link if anybody wants. And there's issues. A lot of people have talked about the issues of exceed expectations, right? I think that if we're like, well, we don't expect perfection, but we expect you to exceed our expectations. The problem with it is that the students who don't get there get penalized. And I think it's a little bit tough for those students to feel like they're always trying to catch up to this moving target. So I think that we need to be careful of who we're rewarding and who we're leaving behind. Because some students might get the message of never stop learning, keep going. But a lot of the students, my students, got the opposite message of never good enough. I'm never good enough at Spanish, so why even try? And that is the opposite of what I wanted to do. When we're talking about progress in output, definitely think about that it's not always about longer sentence, not always about greater accuracy, not always about new structures, right? So it's not always about a new sub-level. Progress is about new topics, even if it's the same level. Progress is about faster retrieval, which is fluency, is only one little part of proficiency. Progress is also about strategic competence. If the student doesn't remember the word, but is able to make themselves understood, I give them a standing ovation, right? That is communication. So I'm not going to penalize you just because you didn't remember that particular vocab word. I want you to get resourceful with language. Show me you are resourceful with language, and I will reward you for it, because it is indeed one component of communicative competence. Okay, I'm going to close here. I'm going to stop here so that we have time to do the survey at the end. And I'll also share my link there with my YouTube channel, my Twitter and Facebook pages. And then let me share real quick the eval form. So if you are an Illinois teacher, please make sure that you complete that evaluation form to get your professional development hours. The recordings are going to be available very, very soon. Thank you. I have the recording. We're going to be posting them in the website for the Downstate Illinois chapter of AATSP, but I'll send the link to everybody once both sessions are posted on the website. I'm happy to stay for a few questions. My laptop is about to die. Great timing. But I'm happy to stay for a few minutes. If anybody has any questions, and yes, please, if you are an Illinois teacher, make sure you fill out the evaluation form. If you're not an Illinois teacher, you do not want professional development hours, you don't have to. So thank you all very, very much for being here on a Monday evening. I hope to see you, maybe some of you at ACTFL. Anybody going to ACTFL? I hope I can see some of you there. I'll be in Chicago this Friday. All right. Thank you all very much for being here. And if you need anything, you can always email me. But yes, we will post the recordings very, very soon.